Non-Monogamy Help is a podcast where your questions about open, non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships are answered. Our host, Lola Phoenix, will consult a licensed therapist with over a decade of experience to address your problems. Names and locations have been changed or censored to keep your questions anonymous. You're listening to Non-Monogamy Help, the podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 160 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. I'm Lola Phoenix. Please send your questions to ask@nonmonogamyhelp.com and they'll either be in the podcast or the column anonymously. You're more than welcome to let me know which one you would prefer. If you want to read the columns and listen to all the podcasts, you can find everything at nonmonogamy.help. You can sign up to all of the emails that I send out on Wednesdays. It's just the podcasts and the columns. It's nothing else except deals when I have them. nonmonogamyhelp.com/email. And you can follow the column and podcast on Instagram at nonmonogamyhelp.com and on TikTok at nonmonohelp. If you want to support the podcast, I'd really appreciate if you would subscribe. You can do that at nonmonogamyhelp.com/subscribe. There is a podcast shout out tier if you want to have your name read at the end of the podcast all awkwardly, like I do. Let's get to this week's discussion question. If this is the first podcast episode, I read a discussion question for you to use with friends, partners, or anyone else that you want to get to know a little bit more. It's pretty basic, pretty simple. I go through it myself to give you a little bit of context. This week, we're doing another Otter Being polyamory conversation card question. And these are cards that you can get that talk about polyamory subjects. And they're very, very useful. You can get them at nonmonogamyhelp.com/cards. And you get 10% off when you buy them using Non-Mono Help at checkout. All right, so one of the cards that we have is, on what terms are others, especially other partners, welcome in a living space you share with someone else like your nesting partner? I don't share a living space with nobody, and I'm very, very lucky in that regard. I have not been able to live on my own for the vast majority of the time I have been an adult. When I was living in London, especially, it was not something that I could afford to do. It's very, very hard to find one-bedroom places, let alone affordable one-bedroom places, unless you're a banker or somebody working in finance, and you can afford that. I could not do that, but I have had the chance to do that because I left the UK, but for lots of different reasons, and I enjoy it. I very, very much enjoy it. I do not think I ever want to live with another human being at all ever if possible, so my preferred way of, or on what terms others are allowed to be in my living space, very few terms, because I also don't invite people to my house. I don't like people in my space, and my space is very sacred to me, and I don't want other people in it. So if you have been in my house, it's because I really like you. Although, if I've said no or tried to avoid that, it's not because I don't like you. It's just that my personal space is my personal space, and I take it very seriously and don't want other people in it. So yeah, I guess no term is the answer to that question. But I think I would invite partners over, probably sparingly, but it's not like I wouldn't allow them over. But I would want just them. I don't think I'd want guests and other stuff no, not for me. So the question is, on what terms are others, especially other partners, welcome in a living space you share with someone else like your nesting partner? Let's get to this week's question. I'm in an ethical, non-monogamous relationship, but they have gone against boundaries multiple times. How would you recommend to rebuild trust? Before we get to this week's answer, I want to quickly remind you of this episode's sponsor, BetterHelp. Quite often in my columns and podcasts, I encourage people to seek a polyamory-friendly therapist. And for a lot of people, finding one locally may be out of their budget or impossible. BetterHelp allows you to find therapists online that you can send messages to at any time of the day, and they also offer some financial aid. You can get 10% off your first month by using the promo code NonMonogamyHelp or going to betterhelp.com/nonmonogamyhelp. Let's get to this week's answer. I totally forgot to explain in the last episode that I did that this question and the question in the last episode, 159, come from the NGL app that I put out on Instagram. And even though people are free in the NGL app to I use that because I want people to submit anonymous questions, and the NGL app allows you to have way more characters than a typical Instagram Q&A box does. So, but sometimes I get questions like this, which are not bad, but I don't have all of the information here. in terms of gone against boundaries multiple times. I don't necessarily know what that means. What I will say, though, is that this is another example. And again, I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm not trying to say anything. But this is another example of people using the word boundary when that's not really what they mean. There's a difference between a rule and a boundary, but specifically a boundary is about what you will do in response to somebody else's behavior. So if someone's gone against your boundaries multiple times, within that boundary should already be what you will do in response to someone else's behavior, right? So like a good example of that is like a rule is you're not allowed to get drunk and come home drunk because I don't like being around drunk people. That's a rule. A boundary is if you come home drunk, I will sleep in a different room or I will not talk to you until you're sober. That is about what you will do in response to somebody else's behavior. It's not trying to control somebody else's behavior. And a boundary is meant to facilitate a relationship, right? It's meant to help you actually do what you need to do to take care of yourself so that you can actually continue to have a relationship with somebody. Because if you say to somebody, and maybe this isn't the best example, but if you say to somebody, you're not allowed to get drunk, you're controlling what they do. You may create a situation where they feel like, that they can't, if you don't allow them, they may create resentment. There's lots of reasons why that doesn't really effectively work. Other than, you trying to control another grown adult's behavior. And there's lots of reasons why that may create space in between two people. Like people don't generally like to be controlled or told what to do. So doing that, even if you have the best intentions in your heart, doesn't really help facilitate the connection. Whereas like you can say, all right, I can't control what you do. If you want to get drunk, you're a grown adult, but I don't want to be around that. And that's also valid. That's also legit. So like if you come home drunk, I'm going to be sleeping in a different room or I'm going to, I'm just not going to talk to you whilst you're drunk because I don't like that. Another good example of this that people often do is, if somebody, really good example of this is if you have like a parent or something that like comments on your weight, right? Like, yeah, maybe they're trying to come at it from a good place, but getting into an argument about that isn't helpful. Also, them commenting on your weight is like making you not want to be around them. And, you don't want to put up with that mess. So instead of saying, don't make any more comments about my weight, or you're not allowed to make any more comments about my weight, which you can try to do. And again, you can make requests of this nature. You can ask somebody not to do something. I'm not saying you can't make a request. And sometimes it's easier to make a request first, see how that goes. And then if they don't seem to want to follow that request or adhere to that request, then you can sort of put in a boundary. But a boundary to that would be if you, to change the subject, like you tell yourself the second they mention a comment about your weight, you're not going to comment on it. You're not going to have any reaction. You're just going to immediately change the subject. Or you're going to immediately say, especially if it's like one of those family dynamics where you're supposed to just grin and smile and nod along with everything. If they mention your weight, you can say, I asked you not to talk to me about that. Or I have asked you to not comment on that. Please don't comment on that. And then change the subject. So it's like about what you will do in those situations. So someone going against your boundaries multiple times, you should have a response to that. If you have a boundary, if you have said to somebody, I don't want this to happen, or if you don't want something to happen, then you need to decide what you're going to do in response to that. And hopefully you have a response to that. I think it can be quite difficult because I don't necessarily know what the boundaries are. And I don't necessarily know if it's something that is understandable. Like I'm not saying that you're not being fair or any of that. But I do think sometimes especially if people are new to non-monogamy, they put kind of these boundaries down that are somewhat unreasonable. There are sometimes as well when people kind of allow for non-monogamy, but then they put so many rules and boundaries around the ways in which their partner is allowed to practice non-monogamy that it makes it functionally impossible. So it's hard to say like whether or not these boundaries are reasonable fully, like no offense. But I do think that if there's something that's happening that you don't want happening, you can't really control other grown adults. What you can do is the 3 C's, which is first, you can consent to the situation. You can say, okay, clearly, and again, it's so hard because I don't know what boundary this person has crossed. So I don't know if it's or if you've made a request or not. But you can consent to the situation. You can accept the fact that whatever this is that this person has done, they don't intend to do, and that can be something that I guess as an example, if one thing that people kind of ask, maybe it's sexual health. So that is a big thing that is very reasonable, that, using, if you make a request as saying, please use condoms with other partners, and, they have an accident, whatever, things happen, blah, blah, blah. One time, maybe you're just like, all right, but like, please don't let it happen again. Like, please, and then it keeps happening. So again, like, you can consent to the situation. You can decide that this is the price of admission for dating this person. They don't seem to be very responsible. They seem to, when they're in the heat of the moment, not really think clearly. That's one thing you can do. The second thing you can do is you can confront the situation. So you can ask them to change. You can point it out. You can say, hey, so I kind of noticed here that you don't seem to be using protection as I have requested that you use protection, and it's really important. And I would really, really hope that you would do that. And that is something that I definitely think that more people should do, because I do think people kind of consent to stuff or kind of go along with it, but then build up like super resentment. Like, they're not really consenting to the situation, because that's what I mean by consenting. I don't mean to like tolerate it and then continuously build up resentment over time. I mean, actually consented, accepted as the price of admission, and not hold resentment for it. And if you can't do that, then you can't consent to the situation. You're not consenting to it. Confront them about their behavior. And then maybe you want to make negotiations. Maybe, there are lots of situations where, specifically in the sexual health example that I'm giving, maybe you decide to up the protection that you use with that partner. So if they are struggling to use protection with other people, then you can say, all right, well, we will definitely always use condoms, or we will definitely always be using these types of protections, and up the protection in between you both so that you feel more safe. That is also an option in terms of like the aspect of confronting, but confronting the issue is really important. And then you can cut the person out of your life. That's the third C. You can decide that you can't deal with this situation. You don't want to deal with this situation. You don't want to have to date somebody that is, for whatever reason, it doesn't matter why they are, the why behind it might emotionally matter in the moment, but like at the end of the day, they're not willing to change, or they can't change, whichever. And you've decided, all right, I'm done with this situation. I don't want to deal with it anymore. So that is kind of the situation that you're in. If they've gone against boundaries multiple times, how would you recommend to rebuild trust? Depends on what those boundaries are. If they are boundaries, have you actually had a response to that? Have you taken action to protect yourself? Have you taken action to decide like, hey, I'm done with this. I don't want to deal with this anymore? Because I think part of the trust that you kind of have to rebuild sometimes, if you have had like boundaries, or you've made requests and then somebody goes against them, and you don't act on that, and you don't do anything, you kind of just let it slide, in a way that's kind of betraying yourself. And then you kind of have to rebuild trust with yourself, because you are showing to yourself when you have a boundary and you want it to enforce it, and you don't really enforce it by like taking those steps to do what it is that you want to do. You're kind of showing to yourself that you're not going to take care of yourself. And that makes it even harder in those situations to rebuild trust, because there's no trust with yourself, right? So you're going to kind of be constantly feeling anxious because, and trying to control other things other than yourself, because you can't act on your boundary, or you can't enforce your boundary. So it depends on the boundary. It depends on what you mean by gone against it. It depends on what you've done. Have you requested? Have you made a clear confrontation of the issue? Have you made requests? And have you decided to act upon what your boundaries are? Your boundaries should always have a action that you're doing. Like, they shouldn't be about what somebody else does. It should be about what you're going to do in response to what somebody else does, to protect yourself and to continue the connection, because continuing the connection is the most important thing when it comes to boundaries. But in general, I'd say, like, if you had any kind of, I had a situation in a partnership once where it wasn't really anyone's fault. We both kind of weren't on the same page as to what we regarded as risky sex. And they ended up doing something that I classed as risky. They didn't class as risky. And that was really hard. But I think having a little bit of compassion for myself and for that person at the time was super helpful. But I don't know if that's what this situation is about. Sometimes I think that if somebody's done something that they've intentionally done to try and hurt you, I don't know is that you should rebuild trust with them. But yeah, I think sometimes this is going to be the struggle with these NGL questions, is that they don't necessarily contain all of the full information that a letter usually contains when I answer it. So if you did write this question, I am going to put something out on my Instagram to let people know and send this response to whomever sent me this question because it was anonymous, then I would really, really invite you to give me more details about it so that I can properly answer it. And I'll do a follow-up episode because heck, why not? But yeah, I hope this helps and good luck. Thank you for listening to episode 160 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. If you want to be awesome, you can sign up to support me. And, I don't make a profit on the podcast. So anything that you give me goes towards like the actual running of things, web space, all of the things that I need to actually put it out there. So yeah, if you want to support me, I'd really appreciate it. Bleh. You can go to nonmonogamyhelp.com/subscribe and you can join the podcast shout out tier. My current podcast shout-out supporters are Ermi, Mike Kander, and Matios Caden. If for whatever reason you can't do that, then you can always sign up to the free tier at the same address. Sign up for the emails at nonmonogamyhelp.com/email. Take a screenshot, share the podcast to your stories, and tag me, and I'll reshare it. That's absolutely fine. Rate and review the podcast on iTunes and Spotify. That's all for this week. This is a episode that you won't get a new column next Friday, another podcast episode in a fortnight. Let me check. You will get a new column on July 11th and a new podcast on July 18th. Thank you so much for listening. You've been listening to Non-Monogamy Help. The music was done by Chris Albury Jones at albury-jones.com. Thank you for listening.